intolerance and violence. And that leads to this vicious cycle of violence and militarized responses, draining resources and causing pervasive insecurity that directly impacts daily life.
And we're seeing specific real-time examples of these internal challenges playing out right now, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. Take Somalia, for instance. There's this constitutional ambiguity around federal governance. It's led to escalating tensions between the federal government and regional states like Jubaland. Just in November 2024, Jubaland openly defied federal authorities. They amended their constitution and re-elected their president for a third term. And this led to both sides issuing arrest warrants for each other's leaders, and Jubaland actually suspended ties with the federal government. It really illustrates this ongoing struggle, between regional states wanting more autonomy and a central government trying to consolidate power.
That makes a lot of sense. And in these discussions, the whole concept of ethnic group and ethnic conflict seems to play such a significant, sometimes central role. How should we understand that dynamic?
Definitions are really crucial here. Our sources describe ethnicity not just as some fixed characteristic, but more as a relationship between people who believe they are culturally distinctive. An ethnic group's identity, it's often formed and reinforced through interaction with others. So ethnic conflicts, by definition, involve two or more groups fighting over resources, identity, borders, or maybe fighting against oppression. And these conflicts are often incredibly violent, destructive, and they can quickly spill over, becoming international affairs. They attract external military and financial support, which unfortunately tends to just prolong them. What's fascinating here is how the post-colonial era really shaped this. The 1962 incorporation of Eritrea into Ethiopia by the UN, for example, directly triggered Eritrea's decades-long armed struggle for independence. And then, after gaining independence, Eritrea found itself in conflicts with nearly all its neighbors, Sudan, Yemen, Djibouti, Ethiopia, often facing accusations of, an aggressive foreign policy. Some post-colonial regimes even intentionally adopted a divide-and-rule policy, right? Empowering certain ethnic groups with monopolies on education, jobs, political power, all at the expense of others. Consider the Afar people in Eritrea. They formed the Afar Revolutionary Democratic Unity Front, ARDUF, specifically to oppose the Eritrean government. They were seeking separate land and recognition, especially because Afars over in Ethiopia enjoyed relative autonomy. So this dynamic, it directly fuels border conflicts and these deep internal grievances.
Wow. Okay, so what you've described about the internal fracturing, the contested transitions, the economic grievances, the ethnic dynamics paints a really vivid picture. But as complex as those internal challenges are, they don't exist in a vacuum, do they? How do outside forces, these global players, then shape or maybe even complicate what's happening on the ground?
That's a critical shift in perspective, yeah. Historically, there was this kind of idea floating around that African states do not go to war with each other, but, that notion has been pretty thoroughly debunked. In reality, interstate rivalries are a substantial factor. They're often characterized by clandestine cross-border military operations and support to proxies by neighboring countries. And this is what prolongs conflicts, like the one we've seen for so long in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It essentially just adds fuel to the fire from the outside.
Right. And here's where it truly gets interesting for understanding global geopolitics. The Horn of Africa isn't just a regional issue, it's truly a global intersection point.
Precisely. I mean, the region, particularly the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, that connects the energy-rich Middle East to Europe via the Suez Canal. It's essentially a jugular vein for global trade. Massive amounts of goods pass through there. So this immense strategic importance, coupled with, impressive economic growth potential and new security threats, it drives intense major power rivalry. The ongoing Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, the GERD dispute, perfectly highlights this. Ethiopia's completion of this massive power-generating dam began production in 2022, expected to double Ethiopia's current output. Well, it's been deemed unlawful by Egypt. And Egypt relies almost entirely on Nile waters for its, over 100 million people and its huge agricultural sector. After 13 years of negotiations, there's still no binding agreement on how much water Ethiopia will release during droughts. So tensions are escalating, even raising fears of war. It's a prime example of how a local development project can have massive regional and international ramifications.
And speaking of that external influence, we have the traditional global powers, but also these increasingly powerful emerging players involved here. It sounds like a really crowded stage.
It absolutely is. The Horn of Africa has historically been a focal point for external intervention. During the Cold War, the USA established military and naval bases in Eritrea and supported Ethiopia's forced federation with Eritrea, which, as we mentioned, directly contributed to Eritrea's 30-year independence struggle. Post-Cold War, the U.S. and EU have often been accused of unduly intervening, in the name of conflict resolution, but frequently with futile results. This suggests to some critics that their true objectives are maybe more about controlling the region's resources or promoting Western governance styles. For example, the U.S. mediation in the Nile dispute. Ethiopia proceeded as partial, leading them to withdraw from the talks. Similarly, in the Tigray conflict, the U.S. and EU faced criticism for meddling, and the U.S. even expelled Ethiopia from AGA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act.
Right, the AGA decision. That was particularly controversial, wasn't it? Just to remind our listeners, that's the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a key trade program allowing certain African countries duty-free access to the U.S. market. What made kicking Ethiopia out so contentious?
It certainly was contentious. Critics argued that the move was, well, selective and inconsistent. They pointed out that past U.S. administrations had overlooked similar human rights violations by other AGA beneficiaries. Furthermore, a joint UN and Ethiopian Human Rights Commission investigation found that all sides in the Tigray conflict committed human rights abuses and obstructed humanitarian aid. But, crucially, they could not verify accusations that starvation was used as a weapon of war. So the termination of AGOA eligibility had significant consequences on the ground. It was estimated to result in the loss of some 200,000 jobs, primarily impacting poor young women and heads of households. And it severely affected small and medium-sized enterprises, too. So while it might have been intended as leverage, it had a very direct and often painful human cost.
So while these traditional powers are navigating these complexities, often facing criticism, new players are stepping in, and they seem to be fundamentally changing the dynamics.
Absolutely. Emerging powers like China, India, Brazil, they're increasingly involved, particularly with development assistance, and often with a different approach. China's engagement in the Horn is incredibly multifaceted. They fully funded that impressive $200 million African Union headquarters in Addis. They've heavily invested in transformative railways like the Addis-Djibouti and the Mombasa-Nairobi lines. They've become a significant military hardware market for Ethiopia. They've built over 80 infrastructure projects in Somalia alone. It's quite extensive. China also holds significant debt from countries like Ethiopia, nearly $14 billion, and Kenya, where China holds something like 67% of its bilateral debt. Their interests clearly extend to natural resources, oil, minerals, and a growing maritime presence. You see this with their military base in Djibouti, and there's speculation about plans for more. Now, while there's definitely wariness in the West about potential debt trapping, the region's governments have, by and large, welcomed China's presence. They seem to appreciate its perceived respect for sovereignty and its focus on mutually beneficial partnerships, often without the same kind of conditions attached by Western lenders.
Okay, shifting focus slightly, the ongoing war in Sudan seems to be a particularly stark and current example of this complex interplay, internal conflicts meeting external forces. What's unfolding there?
Yeah, the conflict between the Sudanese armed forces, the SIF, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, over leadership legitimacy. It's created just an unprecedented humanitarian and economic crisis. Sudan has effectively become a battleground for proxy conflicts. You have regional players like Egypt, Iran, the UAE, all competing for influence, and global powers getting involved too. Russia, for instance, has been carefully trying to balance ties with both the SIF and the RSF. Its Wagner Group has been active there since 2017, securing gold mining concessions and reportedly supporting the RSF with weapons. However, since April 2024, Russia has also apparently begun supporting the SAF, reportedly offering unrestricted military aid in exchange for securing a much-desired naval base in Port Sudan. Iran is also reportedly supporting the SAF, trying to gain a Red Sea presence and counter UAE influence in the region. This kind of escalating geopolitical rivalry dramatically increases the risk of the conflict spilling over, potentially destabilizing the entire region. It could disrupt global trade through the vital Red Sea, impact South Sudan's crucial oil exports, and create fertile ground for jihadist groups and organized crime. It's a powder keg. Ethiopia has officially maintained neutrality, though some experts suggest maybe a subtle alliance with the UAE due to existing close relations. It's a very dangerous and complex situation.
It really sounds it. So, moving beyond the political and geopolitical chess moves, how are these ongoing conflicts profoundly impacting the daily lives of people and the environment itself? What's the actual human cost here?
Well, the consequences are absolutely devastating. Our sources show that more countries experienced violent conflict back in 2016 than at any time in the previous 30 years. And critically, this isn't just affecting the poorest nations. Even middle-income countries are being dragged into these cycles of violence. This fundamentally challenges that old trickle-down theory of economics, the idea that economic growth alone will automatically bring peace. Doesn't seem to work that way. It's projected that by 2030, over half of the world's poor will be living in conflict-affected countries. Think about that. And the Horn of Africa, sadly, has the highest population of refugees and internally displaced persons, IDPs, globally. We're talking millions displaced. Just in recent years, 4.2 million in Ethiopia, 4.6 million in South Sudan alone. The numbers are staggering. And it's truly heartbreaking when you see the statistics for children. Those born in conflict-affected countries are twice as likely to be undernourished, lack improved water, 3 times less likely to be enrolled in school, and twice as likely to die before age 5. It's an intergenerational tragedy unfolding.
And we absolutely cannot ignore the compounding role of climate change here. It really feels like an accelerant to so many of these existing challenges.
Climate change is indeed a critical and sometimes overlooked factor. It directly drives population displacements and intensifies conflicts over increasingly limited resources like water and land. It's a threat multiplier. Recurrent droughts, destructive floods, locust infestations, extreme weather events, they all severely exacerbate food insecurity right across the region. Traditional pastoralist communities, who historically move their livestock for quality fodder, not just quantity, they're profoundly impacted. This leads to resource-based conflicts that have just stubbornly defied many past interventions. Now, while some households are bravely trying to diversify their income sources, the overall vulnerability is just immense. The IMF's heavily indebted Poor Countries Initiative, the HIPC initiative, aims to relieve debt for disaster-stricken countries. And Somalia is actually set to receive significant debt relief soon, which is a positive step. But frankly, so much more is needed to address the scale of these combined climate and conflict-induced challenges.
That leads us to other kinds of instability, doesn't it? Like banditry, which you mentioned, and also the spread of misinformation. How do those fit into this picture?
Right. Banditry is a really complex, multidimensional problem in the region. It's deeply linked to poverty, marginalization, political instability, and just pervasive lawlessness. These networks often have intricate international linkages, making them incredibly difficult to dismantle. And disarmament efforts. They frequently failed, often due to poor state-citizen relations or because they target entire communities instead of focusing on individuals. And there's often a lack of, human security-centric approaches. Then, on another equally damaging front, you have misinformation. It's a significant catalyst for violence and critically aids extremist recruitment. It's often distorted deliberately to escalate conflicts. The Tigray conflict starkly highlighted this. You had media blackouts, reliance on very limited sources, and deeply partisan reporting, which made it incredibly difficult to establish the truth. Both local and international media showed clear patterns of bias, unfortunately. And the advent of modern technology, including drones, advanced cyber warfare tactics, only exacerbates this. It allows for sophisticated and widespread disinformation campaigns that can literally turn neighbor against neighbor. It's terrifying.
Given these immense layered challenges, I mean, it sounds almost overwhelming what efforts are actually being made towards peace. And crucially, where are the gaps in those efforts? What's the potential path forward?
Well, peace-building processes face significant hurdles, not least because you have this multitude of international stakeholders who often fail to coordinate their efforts, simply because their interests differ. Peacebuilding is also heavily dependent on external funding, and post-conflict countries frequently face pressure from global actors who have their own specific priorities and, frankly, their own definitions of what peace looks like. Critically, formal peace processes often tend to focus exclusively on elites. They tragically overlook innovative and arguably far more sustainable initiatives happening at the grassroots level. Women, for example, are frequently left out of formal processes entirely, and their immense value in peace building is consistently underestimated or ignored.
So the solution isn't just about throwing money at the problem or relying on external definitions of peace. It sounds like there's a fundamental disconnect there.
Exactly. The UN's Sustaining Peace agenda is, I think, a crucial step in the right direction. Instead of treating peace as something you do only after a war ends, it frames it as a continuous, holistic effort. It links everything: conflict prevention, humanitarian aid, peacekeeping, peace building, long-term development, trying to get them all working together to build lasting stability, not just stopping the immediate fighting. There's also a growing pledge internationally for support toward social investment, hard infrastructure, and foreign direct investment in post-conflict countries. On the African continent itself, the African Union has a long-standing aim to deploy an African standby force and has prioritized building its own mediation capacities. And they've successfully deployed these in situations like Burkina Faso, the Gambia, Mali, so there is capacity there. The Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGED, has also been at the forefront of capacity building in Somali governance for 20 years now. notably respecting national sovereignty while promoting federalism. These are important localized efforts.
But what's fascinating, or maybe frustrating, is that despite these concerted efforts, both internal and external, we still see continued conflict. Why is that? What's standing in the way?
Yeah, it is frustrating. A major reason often cited for the failure of many peace efforts, like those we've seen struggle in Sudan, is that initiatives are attempted outside of existing continental frameworks, specifically the African Peace and Security Architecture, or APSA. APSA is the AU's comprehensive framework designed for conflict prevention, management, and resolution. And both the AU and the regional mechanisms like IGAD are specifically expected to play the leading role. As former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan wisely emphasized years ago, the international community should complement rather than supplant African efforts. When external actors bypass these established regional mechanisms, it often undermines their effectiveness and just creates unnecessary friction.
That makes sense. So this raises the really big question. What does a truly sustainable path forward actually look like for the Horn of Africa, given all these complexities and historical challenges we've discussed?
Fundamentally, it requires genuine cooperation among the Horn of Africa countries themselves. That has to be the starting point. Coupled with that, you need a significant reduction in these unduly interventions from external powers whose true objectives, let's be honest, often diverge from local needs and aspirations. Our sources recommend investing heavily in vital sectors like health, education, and employment, creating real opportunities. Also, strengthening historical and cultural bonds between communities and promoting regional media that highlights the region's shared economic potentials and common interests, rather than just conflict. Organizations like the American Friends Service Committee and Broad for Die they've developed a compelling 10-year advocacy strategy, ASPS 2023-2033. It's built on five crucial pillars: human security with a strong emphasis on youth and women transitional justice, and healing, governance, and climate and environmental justice. This strategy prioritizes evidence-based research to inform policy, and it focuses on improving the rule of law, accountability, transparency, human rights, the basics of good governance. Ultimately, it champions what they call a new chapter of forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation to address those deep historical grievances and ensure justice for refugees, stateless persons, and IDPs. It's really about rebuilding from the ground up, with local voices firmly at the center.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you, our listener, trying to understand this incredibly dynamic and often turbulent region? What really stands out after hearing all of this analysis?
Well, I think it means recognizing that the Horn of Africa is just not defined by a single issue or some simple narrative. It's far more complex than that. It's a region where these deep-seated internal governance challenges, the complex ethnic dynamics we talked about, and the devastating impacts of climate change are all profoundly amplified by intense global geopolitical competition. Sustainable peace, as we've seen from the sources, requires a truly multifaceted approach, one that genuinely prioritizes local solutions, pushes for inclusive governance, and demands a strategic shift from external players, a shift from dictating terms to genuinely supporting the region's own pathway forward.
And ultimately, the stability or instability of the Horn of Africa has these incredibly far-reaching implications. It's not just for its own people, but for global trade, international security, and humanitarian efforts worldwide. This deep dive has hopefully highlighted the immense human cost of conflict, but also the very real potential for a virtuous cycle of cooperation and development if, and it's a big if, the right principles are genuinely applied. It's easy to get lost in the geopolitical chess moves, isn't it? But then you hear statistics like children being twice as likely to be undernourished in conflict zones. It really brings you right back to the urgent human cost.
Indeed. The choice between perpetuating this vicious cycle of conflict and underdevelopment or actually embarking on a path of genuine cooperation and sustainable growth, it truly rests on the ability of both internal and external actors to align their interests with the dignity and aspirations of the people of the Horn. And what's fascinating here is that despite all the high-level peace talks and external interventions, some of the most enduring peace building often happens quietly at the grassroots level. Imagine, for instance, women from rival communities coming together, maybe forced by necessity during a drought, to manage a shared water source. And through that daily interaction, they slowly, painstakingly rebuild trust. That's a powerful thought to perhaps leave you with.